Just passing out the invite to the BEMA Club meeting today, their first meeting, 12:30, over in the Arts-X building in the radio station. So if you're interested in getting involved in either in student radio, where you could do a music show or a information show if you wanted, that's a lot more work. Or if you wanted to get involved in some of the other activities that the club has, which is sometimes participating in campus-wide events where people recruit for clubs and put forth causes and have fun and dance and stuff. And sometimes BEMA Club members, BEMA is our Broadcast Electronic Media Arts Department. BEMA Club members will play music there, DJ and stuff. We have a setup for that. Or we can also talk about inviting people, maybe people from the industry. You might be interested in hearing from somebody who works at Twitch or something like that, maybe. So the club can invite them. They have a budget and they can organize and stuff. So do come by at 12:30 if you have time, even if it's just to support the existence of the club, if you don't see how you might necessarily be involved. But we do need to get, I think it's about a dozen full-time students sort of with their name on a list to make sure that the club gets accredited and everything gets up and running. And sometimes our department has a lot of, we have a lot of part-time students who come in from other jobs and stuff, and they may want to be involved, but they may not have all the credits necessary to make the club actually run. So if you can make it, much appreciated. Okay? Cool. Otherwise, we were looking at how to get a hold of the stream or the archived versions of class. So we've had a couple of troubles with streaming. First of all, interruptions of power in the building over where the stream is actually converted and processed. I mean, the control room's over here, so they can record it, but when it gets over to our building, if the power's out, they can't stream it. So we had a couple problems with that, and then on Thursday, I think it was, the actual service, who we contract with to put this stream out, they ran into trouble. I think it was actually the interaction between our whole college, which did something that changed the firewall here, made it impossible to get the signal outstream. So I'm sorry about that. Hopefully, at least the latter problem is solved, and the interrupted power in our building, they're working on that. So that means you may not get the stream, but I just wanted to show you where the archive version is. So if you look on our homepage, there's a link here that says streaming information. So you can click on that, and I think most people know that that's where it is anyway. If you go through to the webcast page, here it is. And so you'll see us right now, we're in progress, so all's well, we're actually streaming. But then if you want to see an archived version of the show, I found, first of all, I couldn't find it, and then looking again, if you go right down to the bottom, archive distance learning videos, then they're all showing up here. So this is from the actual streaming page, and then there's another way to get it, which is going to YouTube, to the EATV page on YouTube. So if you go over there, I found it a little easier to find this time, so the latest are posted up there. So that was our class from last week. So that's just a reminder about how to get to see the lectures, especially if they didn't work streaming and you want to see them archived, or you want to review something in the archive, there it is. And if you are streaming, I really appreciate it if you join us in chat. So down the left side of your canvas, if you just click on chat, you get into the class chat. And we do our best to take any questions or any comments from chat, jump back once in a while to see. But it's also just really good to see who's actually following along. It makes me feel like, okay, I don't need to worry about that student because they've been there in chat, so I know that they're still participating in the class. So that would be great. We have an assignment coming up on Thursday, and so just wanted to look through that and see how you're doing, if there's any questions about it. So how are you all doing on your media diary?
I turned it in.
You turned it in, Chow?
Yeah, but I mostly wrote what happened more than the analysis.
Okay, that's good. So Chow says she turned it in and mostly what happened more than the analysis. So remember, an important part of this is the diary part, right? Which is where you actually pay honest, close attention to how you do use media. So just, you know, again, I suggest you just do, you know, the medium that you used, like let's say TV, and the time you used it, you know, 2 hours, and then let's say day, and it would be Sunday, you know, for what? Game or something like that. Just so you have a note for yourself about what you've been doing. And I would assume that everyone's done this, although it's still not too late. And I said do it over a couple of days so that you have something you can compare to. If you just do it when you're in school, you don't have full access to media because you're in classes and stuff. So try to do a day, or you know, as much of a day as you can in school and much at home. Okay, and hopefully this is already done. So that's the first part. Any surprises in the first part? How many people use television the most? If you compare against the others. Ah, interesting. Nobody. How about phone? Phone, yeah, most people. We were down into specific apps. How many people use social media the most? Okay, a lot of people. So that seems to be, you know, pretty much the dominant medium, and we're still kind of processing and working through that. But you know, if you'd asked me to do this when I was your age, it would have been TV for sure. You know, I would, when I came back from school, after school, I'd turn on the TV for about 3 hours and do homework and just sit there and do whatever else. So it was kind of the, you know, we would say the dominant medium at the time, because obviously there was no phone or anything more interesting than that, no social media to interest us. So we spent a lot of time on television, you know. And as a parent, I'm deeply concerned by how much time is spent on social media. Do any of you feel that almost a compulsive impulse to look at social media? In other words, do you feel that you're in control of what you do with your phone and social media? Some folks are nodding, that's good. Anybody feel out of control sometimes? You're all in charge. Well, that's good. My son just went back to school in the last couple of weeks. Got up at 6:30 this morning and immediately went on his device. I said, we don't have time to do that. We got to get out of the house at 7:30 so I can drop you off, you know. And he was saying, I can't help it. I got to see what they said, you know, because he went to bed at 10 last night and there were still people who were awake, right? So I, you know, we should be careful about the words we use. If we use addiction, that's kind of a negative word, but it's certainly a really strong pull. So that's why in this other part of the assignment, I asked you to try to give up your medium or your app of choice for however long as you can manage it. When I did this in college, they asked us to give it up for a week. That was cruel. But if you can manage for a couple of hours, I'd say just long enough so that you do feel just how important it is to you, you know. And so then write it up in a couple of pages, which is due on Thursday. And at least the first half, as Chow might have mentioned, at least the first half is largely just sifting through, you know, your notes. Like, what media did you spend the most time with? Which one did you spend a lot of money on, perhaps? How do your media choices relate to your interests? So this number one could easily be, you know, a page out of 2. So number 2, how do your media choices relate to your interests and personal identity? So this is what I'm saying. Analyze, think about what you do with media. So that question, you know, goes to your interests and personal identity. So any questions about what that might mean? Does anybody find that, for instance, the kind of music they listen to says a lot about who they are? Yeah? Okay. that's kind of the thing that we're getting at here. And maybe other people didn't raise their hand up, but so what kind of music do you listen to? What does it say about you?
Well, like, it's more like what I'm into rather than more of what I, like, the type of person that I am. Kind of like,
I got it.
I'm mostly like into like either like club music or like Japanese or Korean music.
Got it. So this is like, what's your passion? And that kind of sets you apart from other people. Yeah. So that's great. Did you find that in your media use that was coming out, that you spent a lot of time listening to that music?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the kind of question that we're asking there. It's like, sometimes you just want to be entertained or not bored or pass some time, but sometimes you're also, it's more important to you the type of media you actually are working with. So, it's got a deeper importance. And then this one question, all of these are just ideas about what you could think about. It's like, you wouldn't want to bother just saying, my media choices have nothing to do with my personal identity. It's like, just go on to the next one and see, what do you actually, what can you find that's interesting that you want to talk about? So how does your media usage compare to or contrast with that of your classmates? So just, this class or anybody of your generation, it's like, so what do you think, how do you measure up to what everyone else is doing media-wise at your age? And finally, how was it to live without the medium? Did you feel the loss of it? And in what way did you feel the loss of it? Did it make you, did it make you feel out of touch? Did it make you feel relieved that you didn't have to deal with something? Were you bored because you didn't have it? Were you gratified because you found something else to do, like talk to somebody else on the bus or something? So, check it out. So that's due on Thursday, like 2 pages, and there's an example here which runs more like 3 pages. So don't feel bad if you don't have something quite as long as that. But it was up there just to give you, an example of what a really good job on this assignment would look like. So any questions? Okay, good. I hope you're going to find it interesting. I'm always interested because, as I mentioned, I think, when there is a generational divide, not only do I sound old when I talk about what it was like growing up with TV, but I also don't really know what it's like growing up with the current media mix, Okay, so last class we made some great headway in talking about the history of electronic media and radio. And so this week we're talking about television history and, again, leading us up to the current moment with just some ideas about what's happening to TV. So if I was a broadcaster and I just asked a room full of young people, what did you spend the most time with? Did you spend time with television? And no one put their hand up? How would I feel? And why would I feel that way? So I say, folks, how many people spent most of their time what they were monitoring watching TV? What would you say? I'm in the TV business. How would I feel? Pardon me? Heartbroken?
At least, yeah.
Or worried? Anxious?
Yeah.
Anxious?
The competition probably, like you'll be thinking about competition that you have to deal with from other media.
Yes, and maybe thinking about how can I get those listeners back?
Listeners and watchers. Right?
Watchers, yeah. So I'm losing audience to other media. How can I get it back? Absolutely, yeah. So we've seen, we'll see television become the dominant medium and then kind of lose power, I think. It's currently, although video is very much watched, television itself is changing, that's for sure. The only thing I'd say is, and we'll look further into industry developments, but just be aware that, any company that owns television also owns a million other things. And currently, one of the ways of avoiding risk in the broadcasting business is to own a whole bunch of different types of media. And so we'll see that a lot of television companies are also held by larger companies that have a part in the competitors to television. So they protect themselves. So so we're way back in the early days of television. And fundamentally, television is radio that can send pictures because it's basically working in the same electromagnetic spectrum. In fact, the sound from broadcast TV actually dips down into the FM radio frequencies. So they're very close to one another. The challenge was simply in figuring out how you could break down a television image, a picture, and be able to send it through the airwaves. And that was a pretty big challenge. So there was an early system that was a mechanical system. And we have a little film which will show you what that means. But so basically, the important notion was one had to be able to break the image down, and the way they did it was through scanning, as you can see. But the early systems were really noisy and didn't work well, and eventually a functional system was made. There was an electronic system, and so the scanning wasn't mechanical, it was electronic, and it involved a couple of inventors who we'll look at in a second. One of them was Vladimir Zhorkin, and he worked for RCA. Remember, RCA became big at selling radio sets and was connected to the NBC, National Broadcasting Corporation, and David Sarnoff. So Sarnoff was a big booster of television. Remember, Sarnoff was the executive who sort of held back FM radio because he wanted to open up a space for consumers, let them keep their money so that they could buy television sets. Because FM and TV sort of developed around the same time. Remember, Howard Armstrong, the inventor of FM, was mortified that he couldn't profit from the great invention of FM radio because, in part, Sarnoff held it back to make sure that people could have the money to invest in television sets instead. So there was a patent battle, and there was a race to develop a television system that worked adequately. Even, throughout the 1930s, they were working on it. And so let's actually check out that little documentary. Unfortunately, it's not the greatest quality, but it's, let's just see if I have a direct link to it here. And sound. All the way up here.
Wait, did you ever wonder how all this happened? How you can turn that knob and enjoy a dramatic show, laugh at a comedian, watch the ball game, or hear and see news from anywhere in the world? Well, it's quite a story, the story of television.
At the beginning, there were all kinds of different names for what we now call television. Some people called it radio vision, or the telephonoscope, or audio vision, or hear listening. The name that finally stuck, of course, was television, although not everyone liked that. The editor of the Manchester Guardian in England said, television, the word is half Greek and half Latin. No good will come of it.
What is the origin of that no-good technology that sits in our living rooms? The smooth electronic picture you're watching right now. Was it invented by an Idaho farm boy, a Russian immigrant, or a Scottish inventor named John Logie Baird? The
This is a 1930 Baird Televisor. This was the first mass-produced television for the British television market, essentially the first commercially available television for the average person to afford. You could buy this unit with a cabinet on it with a nice bronze plaque on the front for about £25.
Baird's Televisor, invented in 1929, looked radically different from the electronic tubes of modern television. Instead, his was a mechanical system made up of rapidly spinning, rotating parts. In Baird's mechanical television, light from a subject hit a spinning disc, breaking it into pieces. Each piece of light hit a photoelectric cell, which converted the light into electricity. A bright piece generated a lot of electricity. A dark piece, a little. The changing electricity was sent to a receiver, causing a neon bulb to rapidly flicker bright or dark for each bit of the picture. A receiving disc, spinning at the same speed as the first, put the light and dark pieces back together, like a jigsaw puzzle. Early television was a hit in 1925, when John Logie Baird displayed primitive images at a London department store. But when he applied for the first broadcast license ever, the BBC was nervous.
Well, there were two grounds to be afraid of television. One of them was the fear that it would damage the morals of the populace. The other fear of television was much more irrational, and that was the thought that if you had a television set in your house, the BBC could see what you were doing. And there was one woman who was afraid that the television set would be able to see through the bathroom wall, and she wrote a letter to the paper to this effect. These fears have proved groundless.
Mechanical TV did have real pitfalls. To show up on the screen, the actors had to wear bright blue paint to accentuate the eyebrows and lips. And the discs could never spin fast enough to create fluid motion. The images would always remain flickery and smudged. This Felix the Cat, the first ever cartoon character broadcast, was as good as it got. Baird's system never did catch on. Though a remarkable achievement, mechanical TV is now just a footnote in history. But even as Baird's idea failed, a new electronic vision was being born.
The summer of 1921 found Philo T. Farnsworth in a sugar beet field in Rigby, Idaho, dreaming of trapping light in an empty jar and sending it one line at a time with a beam of electrons. So we'll pretend that we've got an illustration here of Farnsworth's beet field from the summer of 1921. And we find him tracing the rows across the beet field on his disc harrow, one row after another, monotonously into the afternoon. And then he reaches a point, he looks back behind him, and he sees these rows in the dirt. At that moment, he realizes how he can use electrons to trace a TV image. And this is exactly how TV is rendered on your screen today, one line at a time, 525 lines per frame, 30 frames per second, just the way Philo Farnsworth envisioned it on the back of a disc harrow in the summer of 1921.
What 14-year-old Farnsworth realized with his tractor was that a beam of electrons could paint a picture finer and faster than a spinning disc. And it could be done with a cathode ray tube.
A cathode ray tube is a glass tube with all the air pumped out of it. But it was discovered that if you ran electricity through one end, through a filament at one end of this vacuum tube, that electrons would flow from one end to the other. And that's when you have a cathode ray tube. That's called the cathode ray, that ray of electrons.
Farnsworth's electronic television worked on the same principle as mechanical television, but instead of spinning discs, it used cathode ray tubes. The cathode ray tube fired electricity 1 pixel at a time, causing a special coating on the tube to glow. A lot of electricity created a bright spot. A little electricity, a dark spot. The cathode ray tube could paint a picture in 1/30th of a second, fast enough to create fluid motion. In 1926, with $25,000 in private funding, Farnsworth set up a lab in San Francisco to try to turn his beet field vision into reality.
In this age, when they were beginning to develop electronic television, it's sort of analogous to wanting to, but there were always very high voltages present that could give somebody a tremendous shock. And there's some stories about people in the lab gang getting potassium in their eyes and having their eyesight threatened.
Farnsworth was nearing success, but he had a rival, the brilliant Russian engineer Vladimir Zworykin. As early as 1923, Zworykin had submitted a patent for his own television system, but it was denied because it didn't quite work. He was now trying to perfect his system for the radio giant RCA and their visionary president, David Sarnoff, who saw television's future.
Well, I think one of the great marriages in 20th century science, if you will, was the relationship between Dr. Zworykin and David Sarnoff.
Sarnoff was like this great monopoly master buying up all the hotels on the boardwalk, and he didn't want to pay anyone. He wanted to have total patent control over television. And he was hoping Zworykin would do that for him. But Farnsworth was ahead of them and had some patents from 1927, 1928.
Zworykin is given instructions to visit Farnsworth's lab in 1930. And Farnsworth does not know that Zworykin is actually working for RCA because he comes from the Westinghouse labs. So Farnsworth is very forthcoming, believing that he has met a fellow traveler on this new frontier. He is entirely forthcoming and shows him virtually everything that he has developed in the last 3 or 4 years in San Francisco. And he shows Zworykin the finished image dissector tube, and Zworykin holds it in his hand. And there are many eyewitnesses that heard him say, "This is a beautiful instrument. I wish that I had invented it."
Whether Zworykin actually stole Farnsworth's design is unclear, but shortly after his visit, he finally had an electronic camera tube that worked. It even made a brighter picture than Farnsworth's. Under a quirk of patent law, he was able to submit his new system under the original 1923 patent. Meanwhile, Farnsworth had also been successful with his camera and receiver. The key to both men's success? The cathode ray tube, which is why we still call television the tube. But who got there first, the corporate spy or the Idaho farm boy with the beat field vision?
Claim 15 in Farnsworth's patent 1773-980 proves that Farnsworth is truly the father of electronic television.
Zworykin is the father of television. There is no doubt about that. I mean, it is filed in the U.S. Patent Office in the late fall of 1923, the first patent of electronic television tube. He is the father of television.
It was up to the courts to decide. The patent battle raged for years, and the final decision? The father of the modern television, Philo Farnsworth.
It was a big victory for Farnsworth and certainly a great defeat for RCA. David Sarnoff couldn't have been happy about this. It meant they were going to have to pay royalties.
So patent control for electronic television belonged to Farnsworth.
But the problem is he may have done it too early. He got his first patents in 1927. And by the time television got going commercially after the war, because World War II delayed things for 5 years, many of his patents had expired. So he was no longer receiving royalties for it, and RCA had taken over the manufacturing of television sets, and Farnsworth just got left in the cold.
Farnsworth may have won in court, but he lost in the marketplace. Today, we all know his invention, but we barely know the name Philo Farnsworth. And what would the rival inventors think of what's become of television?
There's one very interesting story about Zworykin. I believe it was in Canada in 1954, when some Canadian reporter asked him what his favorite thing was on television. And he always had a very pronounced Russian accent to the end of his life. He said, "Das switch." And the man said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "Das switch, to turn the damn thing off." He was very saddened that television didn't realize its potential.
But in July of 1969, Farnsworth and his wife sat in their home in Salt Lake City, and they watched Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. And he turned to his wife and he said, "This has made it all worthwhile."
goes. The teenager, what was it? The beat field fantasy of a farm boy from Idaho. I love the way they put that. So, do you guys think you would have bought the early mechanical version of TV? No. I don't think so. It kind of lacked, what did we say last class in our principle, when cost, convenience, and availability come together, then something will make it in the marketplace. Well, okay, cool. The mechanical version of television was anything but convenient because it was noisy and it sat back in people's, homes. However, electronic TV was sort of poised to take off after Farnsworth and Zyorkin had perfected it. But it's still a good point to make and sort of bear in mind that sometimes the best technology doesn't make it. You know, the FM radio was a lot better than AM, but it had to wait almost 25 years before it really fulfilled its potential. And in this case, Farnsworth versus Zyorkin in the 30s, it was pretty much ready to go. But there was, the financial settlement between RCA and Farnsworth to go through. And then the war, the war happens. And so commercial television is held back again because the kind of manufacturing of electronics that would be necessary to roll it out on a mass scale wasn't possible because the electronic industry had to produce radar and all kinds of other stuff for the war effort. So it was held back. 1939, TV debuts at the World Fair. Let's just see.
As early as 1923, David Sarnoff, now president of the Radio Corporation of America, recognized the possibility of developing a television system. In an historic memorandum to RCA directors, he had this to say, quote, "I believe that television, which is the technical name for seeing as well as hearing by radio, will come to pass in due course," unquote. 16 years have passed since that visionary report. Now David Sarnoff is ready to introduce television to America and to the world as an industry and art, and not merely as a novelty as so many people have previously thought. He is about to predict why television will have great impact on our lives. His message, the birth of an industry. David Sarnoff's appearance before the television cameras in front of the RCA exhibition building at the New York World's Fair 1939 marks the first coverage by television of a news event. His appearance also represents the introduction to the public of black and white television on a commercial basis.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry that Mr. Whalen is unavoidably prevented from being with us today. All about us, we see proof of his vision and ability and that of his able staff. It is fitting that the greatest World's Fair in history should be the scene for the first public showing of one of the most significant technical and social advances of modern times. When one views the wonderful social and industrial developments embodied in the exhibits at the New York World's Fair, he has reason to be proud of the ingenuity of his fellow men.
It sounds like it'll take a while for him to get to the point, I guess. But what are your impressions of the world in 1939, just looking at those clips and stuff? I guess it's fair to say it was a different time, huh? But also, the one thing I'm struck by is the optimism around technology there. The whole 1939 World's Fair is kind of dedicated to showing the advance. Mesa, were you picking that up too, kind of? Yep. Yeah. And so, what do you think Sarnoff's strategy is at rolling out TV at that moment? Why would he pick that time and place? Yeah?
It's when the entire world comes together.
Yeah, good point.
To show what the world is working on.
It's a World's Fair, right? So you're kind of attaching your new product to, what's the latest. You've got the most number of eyeballs there, for sure. Yeah. Do you see a kind of? I always think of Apple rolling things out with Steve Jobs in a black turtleneck and some big San Francisco powwow or something. I'm struck that the showmanship, Marconi's showmanship or Sarnoff's showmanship now as the president of RCA is always this component. It's a great invention. It's going to change the world, but it's got to be sold too. So they pick their places and they have to strategize to put it into the marketplace. Definitely. All right. So you did hear Sarnoff's actual voice there, but again, it's hard to, there are all these names coming at you and stuff, but it's hard to overemphasize the importance of that character in all these stories. First radio, then television, and, dominant at NBC until the 1950s, right? All right, so the familiar players from radio are all involved in television. It's kind of, imagine over about 15 to 20 years from just being a figment of people's imagination, all of a sudden it's a huge business, radio and broadcasting. So, RCA is the set manufacturer, Westinghouse as, the manufacturer of larger infrastructure like antennas and stuff like that, tubes, all the necessary stuff. They're all working together on television now. They rolled it out in '39 at the World's Fair. And then they had to, we already had the FCC, which was licensing radio stations, the FCC in place, adopting a standard for broadcasting, which they called the Ntsc standard, which was the standard for right up until 2009 when we changed to the HDTV standard. So Ntsc was, the accepted standard for how broadcasts were going to be technically accomplished. So that was what they did. But as we said, it was interrupted by World War II, where they couldn't put the manufacturing push that was necessary because all manufacturing was dedicated to the war effort. So it was only after the Second World War that television, which had been ready in '39, actually rolls out in '47 and '48, and all of the big original radio television stations, like here in San Francisco, KGO, KCBS, and the KRON, they all get off the ground in 1948, after which there was a freeze, and the FCC went back to broadening the Ntsc standard. And so for a little while, there was a freeze, and those original television stations were in a fantastic position of being the only stations that were out there that anyone could advertise with, and so on. So they were in a great position. Over a couple of years, there was a freeze, and then the FCC started licensing more stations again afterwards. Once they had settled certain things, which will come up on the next slide. So at that time, there was no way to record this stuff except by filming a television monitor while a performance was on. So early television broadcasts were live. And so what do you think would go into early what kinds of programs would be on early TV if you couldn't record or edit anything? What do you think they would put up there? Yeah?
Maybe for entertainment, there could be something like a Broadway show, like theatrical show.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So theater was a big component of it. Dramatic plays were broadcast. Variety shows and that kind of thing had to all be, stage managed just like a regular theatrical show. So those were big components of early TV. So another thing that we could note as we go through the history is the assertion that the content of any new medium is usually old media. So for television, the content of that medium was stars and shows from radio and stuff from the stage. So dramas or variety shows, anything that could have been on the stage. If you look back to radio, the early content of radio was basically anybody they could find, but it was also stuff like vaudeville, performers and things. So looking ahead now, if you could, I mean, what, YouTube was 2006? I don't know, do you guys, what do you think was the early content of YouTube? Sorry, Chow? No? Or anybody. I don't want to put Chow on the spot. She answers a lot of questions. Yeah?
I think like more like sports and like new stuff, or like kind of like, I guess I'd say like BuzzFeed or something like that.
Well, they wouldn't have been producing video, but on YouTube, I think you're right about sports, and also people were putting up clips of anything that they found interesting and fun. So, yeah?
So more like personal channels, whereas like now like companies have YouTube channels.
That's a good point, and when we go through like the history of YouTube, that we'll find that. But let's say the first thing we have is some of that, and a lot of people posting little clips of stuff that they like from regular TV. Funniest moment from this sitcom, et cetera, which led to a $1 billion settlement against Google, with Viacom suing Google for infringement of copyright, and all that had to be worked out. But, early YouTube, a lot of it was just from other video, from TV. So old media being used to fuel new media. And then pretty quickly, you got user-generated content, you got, what they called multi-channel or operators on YouTube, which would be like new stuff. You had something to say?
You mentioned NTSC. What does that stand for, and what's the difference between NTSC and PAL?
Okay, so NTSC is a standard that was established by the National Television. What is the NTSC? Let's see. It's the National Television NTSC. The National Television Standards Committee. The National Television Standards Committee. So PAL was a similar organization that created a standard in England, I think, and some of the countries that were kind of technological colonies of England. And then there was another one called SECAM, which was for most of the rest of Europe. So these were all analog television standards. And they, in the Philo Farnsworth video, they did mention 520i and 30 frames per second as being the original, so this would be the NTSC standard. And for instance, PAL would have a different frame rate and a slightly different resolution. So we're very North America centric, but NTSC was the standard here in North America, and PAL was over in England and a couple other English influenced nations, and then CCAM was in France and Belgium and Italy and stuff. So what these were basically were complex standards about how a broadcast should be packaged technically, how many lines, for instance, scan lines there were, and how many frames there were per second, and that would guide manufacturers all over the place. Now in 2009, we switched to high definition television, HD TV, which has mostly 1,920 interlaced lines, and still at 30 frames per second, or about. It's actually 29.97 frames per second. So one thing you can notice is our current television standard has much better definition, higher resolution than the original NTSC standard. So standards are, standards are important for companies to, all of them to manufacture compatible sets and cameras, and the whole system has to work on a given standard. But they're also good tools for market manipulation. Because again, as we saw, Sarnoff was able to disrupt Armstrong's FM system by lobbying Congress to change the frequencies for FM radio so that all of Armstrong's work basically would not be compatible with a new set of standards. So standard wars are some ways, there's the patent wars amongst the inventors. There's also the standards wars, which can be used for economic gain. There was even something called the browser war in the late 90s, where, Netscape was competing with Windows Explorer, et cetera, and that was also kind of an industry-led attempt to, get the edge on the competition by making sure your standard was actually the one taken up. So there'll be a little more about standards, but that's basically what we need to know. Is we switched from a kind of a fuzzy square television screen to a nice widescreen with higher definition in 2009. And we're on our way to an even greater resolution, which you can get on Netflix and stuff right now.
I think there's 4K on YouTube.
4K, that's right, yeah. So 4K is eventually going to be an even higher resolution. Now, probably broadcasters won't go there, but anything that comes through a cable will. So Netflix has it, and Chow's telling me that YouTube already has 4K possibility too. Picture just looks clearer. Yeah. So heading back into history, so this is well in advance of where our story's at. But the reason you may be wondering, well, why the heck would they freeze television in 1948 and give all this advantage to the CBS and NBC affiliates that had actually licensed in 48? The reason was they realized there would be huge demand for television channels, and they take a lot of bandwidth. There's not that many channels that were available in terrestrial broadcasting. So they started off with a system called VHF, which stood for very high frequency. But they soon realized that, wow, in each of these cities where we're giving licenses, there are a lot of people who want television channels. We better license some more frequencies. So they opened up what they called the UHF, the ultra high frequencies. And this was part of what they, figured out when they did the freeze. They also actually made it so that, across every market in America, Channel 2 would be on a very particular set of frequencies, Channel 3, Channel 4, Channel 5, which kind of, they were taking care to make sure that if you bought a television set in New York and then you moved to Los Angeles, it would all work well and conveniently and such. So the UHF channels had pretty lousy reception. I do remember, like, when I was becoming aware as a kid, my parents had an old, they would never get a new TV. I was so pissed off. And so, there was still two knobs on the TV, one for tuning UHF, and it was kind of like spinning a radio tuning dial. It was pretty insane. And the picture always looked really crappy. And the channels that were on there were sort of low production value local channels, versus VHF always had CBS, ABC, NBC, the best stuff, and they came in nice and clear. So all that pause there was to create some new channel assignments, and just make sure. Another issue is, like, you can make all this stuff up, but you have to be sure that everybody follows you. So for instance, when we moved to high definition TV in 2009, the FCC mandated that. They said to every broadcaster across America, you're going to stop with Ntsc, you're going to switch to HDTV, no question about it, okay? They didn't do that in radio, and notice we still have old school AM and FM radio. They chose not to force everyone to switch to digital radio. So radio just got left behind. Some other things they did during the Big Freeze, educational channels. They decided, okay, we're going to have some educational TV because people were looking at what the commercial broadcasters did. They said, what is this? I mean, this is all like super commercial stuff. So they made room for educational TV and also color, okay? So there was another mini race going on where CBS actually beat RCA to the punch. CBS had a functioning electronic color television system. That this was almost, you know, what we're looking at is people who might have been early adopters. You know, they might have bought a television in 1948. It was a black and white TV, and they would have spent a month's income. That's basically about how much it would cost. So think about how much people make in a month. That's what they would have paid for a TV. But they figured, wow, this is all free. We don't need to go to the movies anymore. All the neighbors come into our home to watch. It's like a social boon, you know. So they would pay the money for it. But then to come to them for a couple of years later and say, we got color now, but you're going to have to like sell that old TV, which couldn't happen. So this was an interesting thing. CBS had a good color system, but it wasn't compatible with NTSC. It wasn't. And so it failed. RCA came up with an NTSC color compatible system, and so that's what went through on the logic that everyone who already bought a black and white TV could still use it. We would start slowly broadcasting in color. You could get those color shows. They would look black and white on your black and white TV, but if you spent money and bought a new color TV, you could see those shows in color. So the whole idea was not to penalize people who had already bought a TV. So, you know, again, CBS system was pretty good, but the one that got adopted was the one that was compatible with what people already had. You know, so that's the technical situation. Now, in terms of content, in terms of the way the business worked, this was a period where, remember we talked about the network, which would be, for instance, CBS network would then have tons of stations that were affiliates. So they might have one that they actually owned, but then they would have affiliate stations as well. So that would be two types. And then in other markets, you know, they'd have across the United States literally hundreds of affiliates. So CBS and NBC were huge, rich corporations based on the profits that they made in radio. So they were able to set up. Sometimes they could actually own particular stations. So this would be called owned and operated by CBS. And then sometimes they would have affiliate stations which were privately owned, but would make a contract with CBS, let's say, and they would be an affiliate. And the networks had incredible amounts of power, because if they chose to freeze out an affiliate, the affiliate basically was left without any programming. You know, they could make it up on their own, but it wasn't easy at all, as we saw. There's a huge advantage to letting the network create all these expensive shows and then give them to you. So there was an annual agreement, and the network had enormous amounts of power. If they cut you off, it wouldn't work. They demanded what was called clearance. Clearance means that if I'm a CBS affiliate, every show that they give me, I have to agree to show it. And that's all there is to it. So because they were so powerful, they could demand that. But if you were a good affiliate, they would write you a check every month. They would compensate you for being an affiliate. So CBS would pay you to be an affiliate. In addition to that, of course, you made money selling commercials to your local community, right? And so you could make a lot of money by being an affiliate. They paid you, plus, you know, the advertisers paid you.
Just don't get frozen out.
Right, don't get frozen out. Who said, did you say that? Yeah. And you still feel those kinds of tensions now, because let's say you create a show with a little nudity, or you know, you push the edge in terms of cuss words, or you question, how the, evolution or something like that. And you will find, even today that there are some communities that will object to that type of content. And that's where, you run into tensions about clearance. It's like, well, we don't want to show everything you give us because it could offend our community, and then the advertisers will boycott us or cut us off, which is one reason why the networks, respond by creating very unoffensive programming, very safe programming. If I'm sure you've noticed that the most risky programming, you'll see it on HBO or on Showtime or something, which are not broadcasting over the air, they're on cable channels. So they're treated a little differently. When you go to CBS or ABC, you're likely to get, Big Bang Theory or something like that, where there's going to be big jokes, but they're, whoa, man, somebody said that word. It's like really very tame for this reason. So at this point, anyway, in the history or development of TV, the networks have incredible power and can demand clearance. But the payoff is, if you're a good affiliate, you printing money, like 15% rise in profits year after year. So very, very big, lucrative business. The programming came largely out of radio. And so a CBS or an NBC, they had contracts with huge stars. And what they would do, of course, is they'd move them over from radio and put them on television already. And shows that worked really well in radio, they would move them over and produce them for TV as well. So they kind of, cannibalized their radio operations to make television work well. So, they call it radio with pictures, and, a lot of stuff, live productions, as we said. And this brought us into the 1950s. The recordings that we have two things. We have either somebody turned a movie camera onto a television set during a live performance, or, and here Lucille Ball of I Love Lucy fame was one of the pioneers of shooting their television shows on film, editing them on film, and then projecting the film and broadcasting that. So one of the reasons why I Love Lucy clips still look so good is because they were actually produced on, movie film rather than live before the cameras. So that was one way they got around the lack of being able to edit videotape and stuff. Let's get into the politics of the blacklist at another point. But another part of the business that grew up at this time, let's see, there's two things. First of all, there were interesting little bits of history.
This is the Dumont Television Network.
So, there is even a fourth network at that time. Remember, we had CBS and NBC, and then NBC was forced to split because it was viewed as too dominant. This is in the radio days. And so NBC had two networks, they called them the red and the blue, and they split one off. I can't remember whether it was the red or the blue, I'm sorry about that, to create the ABC network. Then when television came in, bang, out of nowhere comes a competitor, Dumont, which was also a camera manufacturer and a television manufacturer. And so in part, RCA and NBC were a very powerful connection, sell the sets, produce the content. Dumont managed to survive for a few years doing the same sort of thing as the RCA NBC.
For 11 years, the Dumont Television Network was very much a part of America's broadcasting landscape. But its path to the airwaves was far less conventional than its rivals. And while that likely led to its early demise, it made Dumont one of television's earliest innovators.
Well, Alan Dumont was an engineer who helped develop the cathode ray tube and the oscilloscope, and he was a tech guy.
A tech guy who founded Dumont Laboratories in 1931.
He was one of the first manufacturers of televisions in the United States. So Dumont won the race to come up with the first receivers, which they started producing in 1938.
Dumont TV sets quickly became the envy of the industry. But in the late 1930s, not many people were buying TVs. Regularly scheduled programming was nearly non-existent. So Mr. Dumont came to a simple realization.
Once you've manufactured the piece of furniture going to the home, you needed a reason why people would buy it, which means they needed programming, and so he developed the programming and the network followed after that.
Throughout the first half of the 1940s, Dumont's road to network broadcasting followed a long line of experimentation.
And they also had to develop their own star system because NBC and CBS, they had the stars of the radio networks that they worked with. They had the business relationships with the people that owned stations, and so they had to carve out a new niche. Wrestling was an early thing that Dumont was involved in.
It would take until 1946 before Dumont began broadcasting regularly scheduled programming. And despite having neither the experience nor the money of giants like CBS and NBC, Dumont made swift inroads.
So they were able to get some stars. I mean, Jackie Gleason, they're relatively unknown stars. Jackie Gleason began his career at Dumont.
Well, I could have had Cadillacs, and I could have had manicured nails, and I could have had fancy clothes. But I didn't throw my money away on anything foolish like that. No, sir. I took what little money I had and got a twin burial plot for us.
Then later on, this was several years into the network, the most popular show on television was the Texaco Star Theater with Milton Berle, who was very closely associated with NBC and RCA. And Dumont came up with the idea, well, we're going to counter-program. We're going to give this Catholic priest by the name of Bishop Sheen an opportunity. We're going to put him up right against Milton Berle. And Bishop Sheen started to beat Milton Berle.
It is a bigger world than we think. Stir your soul, start a wing, and you will discover it to be the wing of an angel of God.
I would say the peak of Dumont probably would have been the early 50s, maybe from 52 to 53, 54. By 54, the signs were on the wall that the Dumont network probably wouldn't survive.
The inexperience and inferior financials Dumont was able to skirt in the early goings began to catch up with the network. The Dumont network held on until August of '56. Its last broadcast was a boxing match. But the innovation and creation weaved over its short lifespan would not be lost, particularly on the first generation to grow up with television.
If you were a young boy growing up in the early 50s, Captain Video on Dumont was every bit as popular as Howdy Doody on NBC.
Stand by for Captain Video and his Video Rangers.
The defining moment for me was on my 10th birthday, June 18th, 1954. And on my 10th birthday, I got the boss's nephew tour of the Dumont Telecenter in New York. And I sat in Captain Video's spaceship, and I met Captain Video. And I never wanted to do anything in my life but be involved in television.
All set, Ranger? All set, Captain. Then turn ship, full speed ahead for Comet X.
It's been called the Forgotten Network, but Dumont commands a much more worthy legacy, a pioneer on the frontier of television broadcasting.
There it is. Yep.
If they had come up with more like shows that they would have stayed like up there with CBS.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the financials involve for sure having the shows and the ratings, but also just the kind of cash flow necessary to, you know, to keep that huge business afloat. Remember that if you're a network, you really depend on having the affiliates all over the country in order to support your broadcasting. And if you can't write as big a check as CBS would to them, why would a local station go ahead and do that? You know, And this was, you know, if we say ABC, NBC, CBS, what's another big network that we're forgetting about? Current. Fox, exactly, right? So Dumont briefly was the fourth big network. In 1980, Fox becomes the fourth big network. And believe me, the problems faced by Rupert Murdoch, who had bags and bags of money due to his global newspaper business, and he was getting into satellites, which is a key focus right now. He had to come armed with a huge war chest in order to woo away affiliates and credible stations from, you know, these big networks. And he managed to poach most of them off of CBS and some local. I think he bought a set of independent stations as a package of about 12 or 14 stations, I think. You know, we can look into the actual history. It's in your textbook, of course. I just don't remember a lot of this stuff off the top of my head. But Fox in the 1980s basically had to win the war of wooing affiliates and paying them well enough in order to start up and get the kind of coverage of the country that's necessary. Because again, if you're an advertiser, you're looking for a national network that you can buy. You know, if you're Ford Motors, you want to buy on CBS and be seen across the country. Why bother going with a small fourth network that, you know, could only get you into, let's say, 14 markets out of, you know, the 60 that you want to be in? So it's tough. And Murdoch pulled it off, largely with huge amounts of money that he could bring from other businesses, you know, versus Dumont, I don't think had deep pockets to be able to sustain that, but they did for a long time. Okay, well, next class we'll get into cable television, the rise of cable, original programming, music, video, premium cable shows, and then we'll get into streaming and how all of that has given us, you know, many, many more channels of TV to watch, and these original networks still persist. So we'll see you on Thursday for that. Don't forget, assignments due on Thursday. Turn it in through Canvas, right? I don't need a paper printout of it. Okay?
Chapter you read this week?
Chapter 3. So we're on the slides of Chapter 3. We're reading Chapter 3. Okay, so we'll see you Thursday.